Marcus Sterling sat in his corner office on the 42nd floor of Sterling Publishing House, staring at the document that could destroy everything his family had built over 3 generations. The hostile takeover bid from Global Media Corporation was aggressive, calculated, and worst of all, legally sound. His lawyers had spent weeks looking for loopholes, but there weren't any. The vultures were circling, and they knew it. "There might be one way out," said Howard Matthews, his grey-haired legal advisor, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "But you're not going to like it." Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, loosening his Italian silk tie. At 38, he was the youngest CEO in the company's history, and possibly its last, if he couldn't find a solution. At this point, Howard, "I'll take anything." Howard pulled out another document from his briefcase. "Your grandfather's will, Section 7, Paragraph 3. Marcus frowned. He knew his grandfather's will by heart. The old man had made sure of that. "The marriage clause? That's ancient history." "It's still legally binding," Howard insisted. "If you marry before your 40th birthday, your ownership stake increases to 60%, making a hostile takeover impossible. Global media knows this, which is why they're moving now. You have 3 months until your birthday." Marcus stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. The setting sun painted the glass towers in shades of amber and gold. "Find me someone suitable, then, Bull. Preferably from a good family, someone who understands business." Howard cleared his throat. "There's a catch. Your grandfather specified that the marriage must be to someone who embodies the spirit of literature, a writer, specifically." Marcus turned sharply. "A writer? Are you serious?" "Dead serious. And there's more. The writer can't be established or wealthy. Your grandfather wanted to ensure the company would always remember its roots in discovering new talent." Marcus ran a hand through his dark hair, feeling a headache coming on. "So you're telling me I need to find an unknown, struggling writer and convince her to marry me in less than 3 months? "Actually," Howard said, pulling out one final document, "I may have already found someone. Emma Chase, 29. She's been submitting manuscripts to publishing houses for the past 5 years, works as a waitress to pay the bills, lives in a small apartment in Brooklyn." Marcus took the file, studying the photograph paperclip to it. The woman had auburn hair and intelligent green eyes that seemed to look right through him. She wasn't conventionally beautiful, but there was something striking about her face, a determination in her expression that caught his attention. "And why would she agree to this arrangement?" Marcus asked, still studying the photo. "Because she's desperate," Howard replied. "Her latest manuscript was rejected by 17 publishers, including us. But I read it, Marcus. It's brilliant. The kind of book that could change everything." Marcus raised an eyebrow. Howard wasn't known for exaggeration. If he said a book was brilliant, it probably was. "So what's the problem? Why was it rejected?" "It's controversial, takes risks. Most publishers thought it was too much of a gamble. But with the right marketing, the right push," Howard let the implications hang in the air. Marcus understood the game now. Marry the writer, publish her book, save the company. It was almost poetic in a twisted sort of way. His grandfather would have appreciated the irony. "Set up a meeting," he said finally. "But Howard, make sure she understands this is business, nothing more." The next morning, Marcus found himself in a small coffee shop in Brooklyn, far from his usual haunts. The place was busy with the morning rush, the air thick with the smell of coffee and fresh pastries. Emma Chase sat across from him, wearing a simple blue dress that had seen better days. Up close, her eyes were even more striking, sharp, observant, and currently filled with skepticism. "Let me get this straight," she said, wrapping her hands around a ceramic mug of black coffee. "You want to marry me to save your company, and in exchange, you'll publish my book?" "That's the essence of it, yes," Marcus replied, trying to ignore how out of place his $1,000 suit felt in this setting. "It would be a marriage in name only, of course. We'd have to live together for appearances, but after 2 years, we can quietly divorce. You'll get a generous settlement, and your book will have the full backing of Sterling Publishing." Emma took a sip of her coffee, studying him over the rim of her mug. "And what makes you think my book is worth publishing?" "Howard Matthews read it. He says it's exceptional." "Howard Matthews rejected it 3 months ago." "Business decisions aren't always about quality," Marcus said smoothly. "But now, circumstances have changed." Emma set down her mug with a sharp click. "So you haven't actually read it yourself?" Marcus felt a flicker of irritation. "I run a publishing empire, Ms. Chase. I don't have time to read every manuscript that crosses my desk." "Then how do you know what you're buying?" The question caught him off guard. There was no condescension in her tone, just genuine curiosity. For the first time, Marcus felt a hint of doubt about this plan. "I trust Howard's judgment," he said finally, "and I'm offering you everything a writer dreams of: financial security, guaranteed publication, marketing support. All you have to do is play a part for 2 years." Emma was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug. When she spoke again, her voice was soft but firm. "My book isn't just words on paper, Mr. Sterling. It's my life, my truth. I've spent 5 years writing it, rewriting it, pouring everything I have into it. I won't let it be published just to save your company if you don't even care enough to read it." Marcus felt something shift in the air between them. This wasn't going according to plan. She was supposed to be grateful, eager. Instead, she was challenging him, making demands. "What exactly are you saying?" he asked, his voice tight with controlled frustration. Emma leaned forward, her green eyes intense. "I'll make you a deal. Read my manuscript. Read all of it. If you can look me in the eye afterward and tell me honestly that you believe in it, that you want to publish it because it deserves to be published, not just because you need to save your company, then I'll marry you." Marcus wanted to refuse. He had meetings, commitments, a company to run. He didn't have time to read some waitress's passion project, but something in her expression stopped him. There was a quiet confidence there, as if she knew something he didn't. "Fine," he said, reaching for his briefcase. "Give me the manuscript." Emma shook her head. "Not here, not like this. Come to my apartment tonight. 7 o'clock. Read it there where I wrote it, then we'll talk." She scribbled her address on a napkin and stood up, smoothing her dress. "Don't be late, Mr. Sterling, and don't bring Howard or any other lawyers. Just you and my words." Before Marcus could respond, she was gone, leaving him alone with a cooling cup of coffee and a napkin that felt like it was burning a hole in his pocket. He had a feeling he'd just lost control of this situation, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly when or how. As he watched her disappear into the Brooklyn morning, Marcus Sterling, the man who always held all the cards, realized he was about to step into a game where the rules were entirely different from anything he knew. Marcus Sterling had never felt more out of place than when he stood outside Emma Chase's apartment building in Brooklyn. The structure was a pre-war walk-up with a fading brick facade and a front door that squealed in protest when he pulled it open. No doorman, no elevator, just 4 flights of stairs that he had to climb in his Armani suit while carrying his briefcase. By the time he reached apartment 4C, he was slightly winded and thoroughly irritated. He checked his watch. 6:58 p.m. At least he wasn't late. He knocked on the door, 3 sharp raps that echoed in the narrow hallway. Emma opened the door, wearing jeans and an oversized sweater, her auburn hair pulled back in a messy bun. The apartment behind her was small but neat, with bookshelves covering nearly every available wall space. The smell of coffee and something baking wafted out into the hallway. "You came," she said, sounding slightly surprised. "And you're on time. I always keep my appointments, Ms. Chase." She stepped aside to let him in. "It's Emma. If we're potentially getting married, you should probably use my first name." The apartment was even smaller inside than it had appeared from the doorway. A tiny kitchen opened into a living room that doubled as a workspace, with a desk pushed against one window. Papers and sticky notes covered one wall in what appeared to be some sort of organizational system that only made sense to its creator. "I made coffee," Emma said, gesturing to a French press on the kitchen counter. "And there are cookies in the oven. I stress bake." Marcus set his briefcase down carefully. "I'm not here for refreshments." "The manuscript?" Emma's expression tightened slightly. "Right, all business." She walked to her desk and picked up a thick stack of papers bound with a simple black clip. "Here it is. The price of silence." Marcus took the manuscript, noting its weight. "How long will this take?" "It's 347 pages. You tell me." He did some quick mental math. 4 hours, give or take. Emma shook her head. "You can't read it like that. Not if you want to really understand it. This isn't a contract to skim through. These are people's lives. Fiction is hardly—" "Sit," she interrupted, pointing to a worn but comfortable-looking armchair near the window. "Read the first chapter. Really read it. Then we'll talk about how long it takes." Marcus wanted to argue, but something in her tone made him reconsider. He sat in the chair, surprised by how comfortable it was. Emma handed him a cup of coffee. Black, no sugar, exactly how he liked it, and then retreated to the kitchen without another word. The first page was blank, except for the title and her name. Marcus turned it and began to read. 3 hours later. 3. He was halfway through the manuscript, his coffee long cold and forgotten. The cookies Emma had baked sat untouched on a plate beside him. He hadn't moved from the chair except to turn pages, hadn't spoken a word since he began reading. The story had grabbed him from the first paragraph, a tale of family secrets, a corporate betrayal, and the price of truth in a world built on carefully constructed lies. The protagonist was a young journalist who discovered that her father's suicide 20 years ago wasn't suicide at all, but rather a carefully orchestrated murder designed to protect a powerful family's reputation. But it wasn't just the plot that held him captive, it was the writing itself. Emma's prose was like a razor wrapped in silk, beautiful on the surface but cutting deep underneath. He looked up briefly to find Emma curled up on her small couch, reading a worn paperback. She glanced at him over the top of her book. "Do you want to take a break?" she asked quietly. Marcus shook his head and returned to the manuscript. He needed to know how it ended. At 1:43 a.m., he read the final page. The apartment was silent, except for the distant sound of traffic and the soft ticking of a clock somewhere. Emma had fallen asleep on the couch, her book resting open on her chest. Marcus sat there for a long moment, letting the full weight of what he'd just read settle over him. Then he stood up, his joints protesting after sitting for so long, and walked to the couch. "Emma," he said softly. She stirred, blinking up at him with sleep-clouded eyes. "What time is it?" "Late. I finished it." She sat up quickly, fully awake now. "And—" Marcus ran a hand through his hair, suddenly aware of how disheveled he must look. His tie was loose, his jacket discarded hours ago. "The Carlton family in your book, they're based on the Whitakers, aren't they?" Emma's expression gave nothing away. "What makes you say that?" "The timeline matches. The suspicious death of their CFO in 2003, the subsequent takeover of 3 smaller companies, the way they supposedly saved those businesses while actually stripping them for parts." He paused, studying her face. "You did your research." "I was thorough," she agreed carefully. "This book, if we publish it, the Whitakers will sue us into oblivion. They'll bury Sterling Publishing under so many lawsuits we'll never see daylight again." Emma stood up, facing him directly. "Everything in that book is true. I have documentation, sources, proof. I spent 2 years investigating before I even started writing." "That almost makes it worse," Marcus said. "The Whitakers don't care about truth. They care about power. And they have enough money and influence to make sure this story never sees the light of day. So you won't publish it." It wasn't a question, but Marcus answered anyway. "I didn't say that." Emma's eyes widened slightly. "What are you saying?" Marcus picked up the manuscript, feeling its weight in his hands. "This is more than just a book, Emma. It's a weapon, a very dangerous one. If we publish this, we're not just telling a story. We're going to war with one of the most powerful families in New York." "I know," Emma said quietly. "And you're willing to fight that war?" I've been fighting it for 5 years. I'm just tired of fighting alone." Marcus looked at her then, really looked at her, in the dim light of her small apartment, with her hair messy from sleep and her sweater slightly rumpled. She should have seemed vulnerable. Instead, she radiated a quiet strength that he found himself admiring despite his best intentions. "Marry me," he said abruptly. Emma blinked. "What? Marry me? Not for the company, not for the publishing deal. Marry me because this book needs to be published, and we both know it's going to take everything we have to make that happen. We'll need each other." "You actually mean that," Emma said slowly. "You believe in the book. I believe in the truth. And I believe in good writing. This is both." He stepped closer to her. "But I need to know something first. Why did you agree to meet me today? You must have known who I was, what Sterling Publishing represents. We're exactly the kind of corporate entity your book criticizes." Emma was quiet for a moment, then walked to her desk and pulled out an old magazine. She handed it to Marcus. It was a copy of Literary Review from 1992, open to an article about independent publishers. In the center was a photo of his grandfather, William Sterling, standing in front of the original Sterling Publishing office. "Your grandfather published my mother's first book," Emma said softly. "She was a nobody, a single mom writing in between shifts at a diner. Every major publisher had rejected her, but William Sterling read her manuscript himself, stayed up all night with it just like you did with mine. He published it because he believed in her voice, not because it would make him money." Marcus stared at the photograph of his grandfather, remembering the stories he'd heard about the early days of Sterling Publishing. Somewhere along the way, those stories had gotten buried under quarterly reports and profit margins. "The marriage clause in his will," Marcus said slowly. "It wasn't just about preserving control of the company, was it?" Emma shook her head. "I think he wanted to make sure Sterling Publishing would always have someone at the helm who understood what it meant to believe in a story." Marcus looked down at the manuscript in his hands, then back at Emma. "I suppose we should discuss terms." "Terms? For the wedding, the living arrangements, the publication timeline." He paused. "Unless you've changed your mind." Emma smiled for the first time since he'd arrived, a real smile that transformed her entire face. "I thought this was supposed to be a romantic proposal. Mr. Sterling—" "Marcus," he corrected. "And romance wasn't part of the deal." "No," she agreed, but her eyes were twinkling now. "But publishing my book and taking down a corrupt corporate dynasty together, that's not a bad start." As Marcus Sterling stood in that small Brooklyn apartment in the early hours of the morning, his perfectly ordered world thoroughly disrupted by a manuscript and its fierce creator, he realized that his grandfather's will might have given him exactly what he needed, not just to save the company, but to remember why it was worth saving in the first place. The news of Marcus Sterling's engagement to an unknown writer spread through New York's publishing world like wildfire. Within days, every literary blog and business publication was speculating about the mysterious Emma Chase and her sudden rise from waitress to future CEO's wife. The story had everything: a rags-to-riches romance, a powerful family dynasty, and the kind of timing that made cynics raise their eyebrows. Marcus watched the media frenzy from his office, scanning through the headlines on his tablet, while Emma sat across from him, looking distinctly uncomfortable in a designer suit that Howard had insisted she wear for their first official meeting at Sterling Publishing. "Cinderella story in the publishing world," Marcus read aloud, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Unknown waitress captures publishing prince." At least, they didn't mention the book yet. "They will," Emma said, tugging at the suit's collar. "The Whitakers have spies everywhere. Someone's going to leak it eventually, which is why we need to move fast." Marcus set down the tablet and leaned forward. "Howard's drawing up a new contract for the book. We'll publish under a pseudonym, create some distance between you and the content. Meanwhile, we'll expedite the wedding arrangements." "No," Emma interrupted. Marcus stopped mid-sentence. "No? I'm not publishing under a pseudonym. Emma's voice was quiet but firm. "I spent 5 years researching and writing this book. I interviewed families who lost everything because of the Whitakers. I promised them their stories would be told. I'm not hiding behind a fake name. Emma, be reasonable. The Whitakers will what? Sue us? Threaten us? Try to bury the truth? They'll do that regardless of what name is on the cover." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. "The moment we show fear, the moment we start compromising, we've already lost." Marcus watched her, noting how she seemed more natural, standing at his window, in that ill-fitting designer suit, than any of the socialites who'd posed there for photos over the years. She belonged here, he realized, not because of their arrangement, but because she understood what words could do. "All right," he said finally. "No pseudonym, but we do this smart. We need allies." Emma turned back to him. "What kind of allies?" "I'm hosting a dinner party tonight. Key people from the industry, editors, agents, critics, people whose support we'll need when the storm hits." He paused. "I'd like you to be there." Emma's expression tightened. "You want to parade me around like your trophy fiancé? I want to introduce you as a writer whose work deserves to be defended." Marcus stood and walked over to her. "These people need to understand what's at stake. They need to see that you're not just some gold digger who got lucky. They need to believe in you like—" He stopped himself. "Like you do?" Emma finished softly. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the pretense of their arrangement felt paper-thin. Marcus cleared his throat and stepped back. "The party starts at 8. Howard arranged for a car to pick you up at 7. Emma nodded. But before she could respond, Marcus's assistant burst into the office, her face pale. "Mr. Sterling, there's a Mr. Whitaker here to see you. Richard Whitaker." Marcus felt his blood run cold. Richard Whitaker was the family patriarch, a man who hadn't set foot in Sterling Publishing for over a decade. His presence now couldn't be a coincidence. "Send him in," Marcus said, then turned quickly to Emma. "My private elevator. Go, now." But Emma didn't move. "I'm not hiding." "This isn't about hiding. It's about choosing our battlefield. Please, Emma." Something in his voice must have convinced her, because she nodded and headed for the hidden elevator door behind his bookshelf. Just as it closed behind her, Richard Whitaker strode into the office. At 72, Richard Whitaker still carried himself like a man who expected the world to bend to his will. His silver hair was immaculate, his suit probably cost more than most people's cars, and his smile was as warm as an Arctic winter. "Marcus, my boy," he said, extending his hand. "It's been too long." Marcus shook the offered hand, feeling like he was making a deal with the devil. "Mr. Whitaker, this is an unexpected pleasure." "Oh, I think we both know this visit isn't about pleasure." Whitaker settled himself in the chair Emma had vacated, his eyes scanning the office with predatory interest. "I hear congratulations are in order. Marriage is a serious step. One hopes the bride is suitable." The threat was subtle but clear. Marcus kept his expression neutral. "Emma Chase is more than suitable. She's brilliant." "Ah, yes, the waitress turned writer. How romantic." Whitaker's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I understand she's been working on quite an interesting manuscript. A novel about corporate intrigue, I believe? Family secrets, hidden crimes." Marcus felt his heart rate increase but maintained his composure. "I wasn't aware you followed unpublished work so closely." "Oh, I follow everything that might affect my family's interests, Marcus. Everything." Whitaker leaned forward slightly. "Let me be clear. That book will never see the light of day. If you attempt to publish it, Sterling Publishing won't survive the legal battles. Your grandfather's legacy will be destroyed. Is that really how you want to honor his memory?" "My grandfather believed in publishing the truth," Marcus said, his voice steady despite his racing pulse. "Truth?" Whitaker laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Truth is whatever those with power say it is. Your grandfather understood that in the end. Why do you think he never published anything controversial in his later years?" Marcus felt something shift inside him, a piece of a puzzle falling into place. "What did you do to him?" Whitaker stood, smoothing his already perfect suit. Nothing he didn't agree to. We made him an offer. He accepted it. Simple business. I'm making you the same offer now. Kill the book, end this engagement charade, and Sterling Publishing can continue to prosper under your leadership. Refuse, he shrugged eloquently. And if I don't agree, then I hope you're ready to lose everything. Whitaker moved to the door, then paused. You have 24 hours to make your decision. Choose wisely, Marcus. Some battles aren't worth fighting. After he left, Marcus stayed at his desk, staring at nothing. A few minutes later, the private elevator hummed, and Emma stepped out. Her face was pale but determined. You heard? Marcus asked. She nodded. Everything. The elevator shaft carries sound pretty well. She walked to his desk and perched on the edge of it, closer than she'd ever been before. So what are we going to do? We? Marcus looked up at her. Emma, you heard him. They'll destroy everything. The company, my grandfather's legacy. Your grandfather's real legacy isn't this building or this company, Emma interrupted. It's the belief that stories matter, that truth matters. They didn't just threaten Sterling Publishing today, Marcus. They admitted to blackmailing your grandfather, to forcing him to compromise his principles. Are you going to let them do the same to you? Marcus stood abruptly, pacing the office. It's not that simple. There are hundreds of employees who depend on this company. Authors with contracts, projects in development. And what happens if you give in, if you let them dictate what you can and can't publish? What's the point of saving a publishing house if you lose its soul in the process? He stopped pacing and looked at her. In the late afternoon light streaming through his office windows, Emma seemed to glow with an inner fire. She believed in this fight with every fiber of her being, and somehow, without him noticing, that belief had begun to affect him too. The dinner party tonight, he said slowly. We're still having it, but not to parade you around as my fiancée. Emma raised an eyebrow. No, we're having it to start building our army, because you're right, this isn't just about your book anymore. It's about everything Sterling Publishing stands for. Everything my grandfather believed in. A slow smile spread across Emma's face. Now you're thinking like a publisher. We'll need to move fast, Marcus continued, his mind already racing ahead. The Whitakers won't wait long to start moving against us. We need allies, evidence, a strategy. Emma stood and straightened his tie, the gesture so natural that neither of them seemed to notice its intimacy. Good thing you're marrying someone who spent 5 years gathering exactly that. For the first time since Whitaker's visit, Marcus felt something like hope. But mixed with that hope was another feeling, one he wasn't quite ready to examine, the growing sense that this marriage of convenience might be becoming something far more inconvenient to his heart. Marcus Sterling's penthouse apartment had never felt more alive. The spacious living room buzzed with conversation as New York's literary elite mingled, drinking expensive wine and exchanging whispered speculations about the real reason behind the sudden engagement of publishing's most eligible bachelor. Emma stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, wearing a midnight blue dress that Howard had insisted on. She looked elegant but uncomfortable, like someone wearing another person's skin. Marcus watched her from across the room as she spoke with Janet Chen, the influential editor of Literary Weekly. Your fiancé is certainly different from your usual type, commented Catherine Reynolds, a veteran literary agent who'd known Marcus since he was a child. She sipped her champagne, her shrewd eyes moving between Marcus and Emma. But there's something about her, a fire. She's a writer, Marcus said simply, as if that explained everything. Catherine's perfectly penciled eyebrows rose slightly. And what exactly is she writing? Before Marcus could respond, the apartment's private elevator chimed. All conversation ceased as Richard Whitaker stepped into the room, followed by his son, James. Neither had been invited. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. Across the room, Emma had gone completely still, her face pale but composed. He made his way to her side, placing a protective hand on the small of her back. I hope you don't mind us crashing your little soiree, Whitaker said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. When we heard you were gathering the industry's finest minds, we felt obligated to attend. The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone there knew about the long-standing rivalry between Sterling Publishing and Whitaker Media Group, but few knew the darker truth behind it. "Mr. Whitaker," Marcus said coolly, "this is a private celebration." "Oh, but how could we not come to celebrate such a unique union?" Whitaker's smile was razor-sharp as his gaze settled on Emma. "Miss Chase, or should I say, the future Mrs. Sterling, your manuscript has caused quite a stir in certain circles." Emma straightened, her voice clear and steady. "Have you read it, Mr. Whitaker?" "I've read enough." He moved closer, lowering his voice so only they could hear. "You're playing a dangerous game. My dear, both of you are. It would be a shame if this lovely engagement ended in tragedy, like so many other challenges to our family's reputation have." Marcus felt Emma tense beside him, but her voice remained calm. "Are you threatening us, Mr. Whitaker? In a room full of witnesses?" "Threatening?" Whitaker laughed, the sound echoing unnaturally in the quiet room. "My dear, I'm trying to save you from yourselves. Marcus, your grandfather understood the natural order of things. He knew his place. Don't make his mistakes." Something inside Marcus snapped. Years of watching his grandfather's decline, of wondering why the fierce, principled man he'd known had become so cautious in his final years. It all made sense now. The Whitakers hadn't just threatened the company, they'd broken the man who built it. "Get out," Marcus said, his voice low and dangerous. "Get out of my home. Think carefully about what you're doing," Whitaker warned. "By this time tomorrow, your stock price will be in free fall. By the end of the week, your major authors will be jumping ship. By the end of the month, Emma interrupted, your family's true legacy will be public knowledge." She stepped forward, matching Whitaker's cold stare with one of her own. "I've spent 5 years documenting every crime, every cover-up, every life your family has destroyed. It's not just my word against yours anymore. I have proof." James Whitaker, who had been silent until now, suddenly lunged forward, his face contorted with rage. "You little—" Marcus moved faster than he thought possible, placing himself between Emma and James. But before either man could move, Catherine Reynolds' voice cut through the tension like a knife. "James Whitaker, if you take one more step, I will personally ensure that every major publication in this city knows exactly what happened at the Hemisphere Club in 2019. Her tone was pleasant, but her eyes were steel. "Some of us have very long memories and very detailed records." James stopped, his face draining of color. Richard Whitaker's composed facade cracked slightly as he grabbed his son's arm. "This isn't over," he hissed, before dragging James toward the elevator. As the doors closed behind them, the room erupted in excited whispers. Marcus turned to Emma, his heart pounding. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though her hands were shaking slightly. "That wasn't exactly how I planned to announce the book." "I'd say it was perfect timing," Catherine said, joining them. The entire room just witnessed the Whitakers threaten 2 respected publishers over an unpublished manuscript. "By morning, there won't be a person in the industry who isn't dying to read it." Janet Chen appeared at Catherine's elbow, her eyes bright with interest. "Miss Chase, perhaps we could discuss an exclusive excerpt for Literary Weekly. Something to set the context before the Whitakers can spin their own narrative." Marcus watched as more industry players gravitated toward them, all eager to align themselves with what promised to be the biggest literary scandal in decades. Emma handled their questions with grace and intelligence, never revealing too much, but giving them just enough to ensure their support. Later that night, after the last guest had left, Marcus found Emma on his balcony, staring out at the city lights. She'd kicked off her heels and was holding a glass of wine, looking more relaxed than she had all evening. "You were incredible in there," he said, joining her at the railing. "We were incredible," she corrected, glancing at him with a small smile. "I saw you, you know. How angry you got when Whitaker mentioned your grandfather. This isn't just about my book anymore, is it?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering her question. I always knew my grandfather changed in his later years, became more cautious, less willing to take risks on new writers. I thought it was just age, but he gripped the railing tighter. They broke something in him, Emma. They took everything he believed in and turned it into a compromise. And now, they're trying to do the same to you. Yes, he turned to look at her directly. But they didn't count on you. Emma set down her wineglass and faced him. What do you mean? You're not afraid of them, even after everything they've done, everything they've threatened to do. You're still standing, still fighting. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture unconscious and intimate. You make me want to be braver. Emma's breath caught at his touch. For a moment they stood there in the moonlight, the pretense of their arrangement feeling more fragile than ever. Marcus, she whispered, we should probably talk about... The shrill ring of his phone shattered the moment. Marcus answered it, his expression darkening as he listened. When? He demanded. How many? I see. No, don't do anything until I get there. He hung up and turned to Emma, his face grim. What's wrong? The Whitakers moved faster than we expected. They're calling in loans, pressuring retailers, threatening our distribution partners. The stock is going to crash when the market opens. He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. They're trying to bury us before we can publish the book. Emma straightened, her momentary vulnerability replaced by determination. Then we need to move faster. How quickly can we go to print? The manuscript isn't even fully edited. It's been edited and re-edited for 5 years. What it needs now is to be published before they can stop us. She placed her hand over his on the railing. You believe in this book, Marcus. You believe in what it stands for. So let's stop playing by their rules and start playing by ours. Marcus looked down at their hands, then back at her face, illuminated by the city lights. In that moment, he realized 2 things with startling clarity. He was falling in love with Emma Chase, and he was ready to risk everything to stand beside her. Okay, he said, let's do it, but Emma, he turned his hand to intertwine their fingers. Whatever happens next, I need you to know that this stopped being about saving the company a long time ago. Her eyes met his, filled with understanding and something deeper. I know, she whispered, for me too. As they stood there on the balcony, hands clasped and hearts racing, both knew that tomorrow would bring either their greatest triumph or their complete destruction. But for the first time, they were facing it not as 2 people bound by a convenient arrangement, but as partners united by something far more powerful than any contract. The war with the Whitakers was about to begin in earnest, and neither Marcus Sterling nor Emma Chase intended to go down without a fight. The next 72 hours at Sterling Publishing were absolute chaos. Marcus had called in every favor, leveraged every relationship, and pushed his team to their absolute limits. The manuscript that should have taken months to prepare for publication was being fast-tracked in a matter of days. Emma hadn't left the building. Working alongside the editors in a makeshift war room they'd set up in the conference center. Coffee cups and takeout containers littered the tables as they raced against time, knowing the Whitakers were mobilizing their considerable resources against them. Marcus stood in his office, watching the sun rise over Manhattan for the 3rd straight morning. The financial damage was already severe. Sterling Publishing stock had dropped 40%. Major retailers were mysteriously delaying their orders, and 3 of their best-selling authors had received lucrative offers to break their contracts. But they weren't beaten. Not yet. The first prints are ready, Emma said from the doorway. She looked exhausted, but determined. Her auburn hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, wearing the same clothes she'd had on yesterday. Somehow, she'd never looked more beautiful to Marcus. How many copies? 10,000. It's all the printer could manage on such short notice. They're being delivered to independent bookstores across the city right now. She walked over to stand beside him at the window. Janet Chen's review goes live in an hour. Catherine's already leaked details to every major literary blog. By noon, everyone in New York will be talking about it. Marcus nodded, then reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a single copy of the book. The cover was simple but powerful, The Price of Silence by Emma Chase, with a minimalist design showing a shattered glass tower. He ran his fingers over the embossed letters of Sterling Publishing's logo at the bottom. "My grandfather would have been proud of this," he said quietly. Emma took his hand, squeezing it gently. "He would have been proud of you." Before Marcus could respond, his office door burst open. Howard rushed in, his usually impeccable appearance disheveled. "They're here." The police. Marcus and Emma exchanged glances. They'd expected this, but not so soon. "What are the charges?" Marcus asked, already reaching for his phone to call their lawyers. "Criminal defamation, corporate espionage, wire fraud." Howard listed off a series of allegations, each more serious than the last. "They're here with a court order to seize all copies of the book and halt publication." Emma's grip on Marcus's hand tightened. "They can't do that. It's prior restraint." "They can try," Marcus said grimly, "and tie us up in court long enough to bankrupt us." The sound of commotion reached them from the outer office. Voices raised, doors opening. "Mr. Sterling," his assistant called through the intercom. "There are officers here with a warrant." "Let them in," Marcus said calmly. He turned to Emma. "Are you ready?" She nodded, her green eyes fierce. "I've been ready for 5 years." The office door opened again, admitting 2 police officers and a smug-looking James Whittaker accompanied by a team of lawyers. "Marcus Sterling," one of the officers began, "we have a warrant to—" "Before you continue," Marcus interrupted smoothly, "you might want to turn on the news." He picked up a remote and activated the large screen on his office wall. Every major news channel was carrying the same story. Breaking news about the Whittaker family's decades of corporate corruption, complete with documented evidence, witness testimonies, and financial records. James Whittaker's face went from smug to ashen. "What have you done?" "We didn't do anything," Emma said, stepping forward. "Your family's victims did. All those people you thought you'd silenced. They've been waiting for someone to tell their stories. The book was just the beginning." Marcus picked up the remote again, changing channels. On each station, different people were speaking out. Former employees, business partners, families who'd lost everything to the Whittakers' schemes. 5 years of Emma's research had given them the courage to finally come forward. "The book copies you're here to seize," Marcus added. "They're already in stores. But more importantly, the full digital manuscript, along with all supporting evidence, has been sent to every major news outlet, law enforcement agency, and regulatory body in the country. You can't bury the truth anymore." The police officers looked uncertainly between Marcus and James Whittaker, whose face had turned an alarming shade of purple. "These allegations are baseless," one of the Whittaker lawyers began, but was cut off by another voice from the doorway. "Actually, they're not." Catherine Reynolds walked in, followed by a stern-looking man in a federal agent's jacket. "Agent Phillips, and FBI White-Collar Crimes Division. I believe you'll find everything in order." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. The police left, taking James Whittaker with them instead of Marcus. News helicopters circled the building as reporters gathered outside. Emma's book was selling out across the city as people rushed to read the story behind the headlines. By sunset, Sterling Publishing stock had rebounded and was trading higher than ever. The phone hadn't stopped ringing, authors wanting to sign with them, journalists seeking comments, even movie studios interested in the rights to Emma's story. Marcus found Emma in his grandfather's old office, a small room he'd preserved exactly as it had been. She was standing by the window, holding a first-edition copy of her mother's book. "Your mother would have been proud too," he said softly. Emma turned, tears glistening in her eyes. "I just wish she could have seen this. Both my parents. They deserved to see the truth come out." Marcus crossed the room and took her in his arms. This time, there was no hesitation, no pretense. They'd fought this battle together, and somewhere along the way, their arranged engagement had become something real. "Marry me," he said. Emma pulled back slightly, looking up at him with a mixture of amusement and affection. "We're already engaged. Ready. Remember?" "No," Marcus shook his head. "Marry me for real. Not because of my grandfather's will or the company or any arrangement. Marry me because I love you, because you made me remember what it means to fight for something bigger than profit margins, because you make me want to be the kind of man who deserves someone as extraordinary as you." Emma's eyes widened. "Marcus, I know it's fast," he continued. "I know we started this as a business deal. But somewhere between that first night when you made me read your manuscript and today, watching you stand up to the Whitakers without flinching, I fell in love with you. Your courage, your integrity, your talent, everything about you makes me want to be better." Emma reached up and touched his face, her fingers trembling slightly. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I started falling for you the moment you finished my manuscript and understood exactly what it meant, not just the words, but the truth behind them." Marcus leaned down and kissed her, soft and sweet at first, then with growing passion. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. "So," he said, resting his forehead against hers, "is that a yes?" Emma laughed, the sound bright and joyous in the quiet office. "Yes, but on one condition." "Name it." "We get married here, in your grandfather's office. Just us and a few witnesses. No society circus, no media circus. Just two people who believe in the power of words and truth." Marcus smiled, pulling her closer. "Deal." 3 months later, in that very office, Marcus Sterling and Emma Chase were married in a small, private ceremony. Howard served as best man, Catherine as matron of honor, and Janet Chen wrote a beautiful piece about it for Literary Weekly. Not about the society wedding of the year, but about two people who found love while fighting for truth. Emma's book became a worldwide bestseller, spawning investigations that eventually led to the Whitakers' downfall. Sterling Publishing flourished, returning to its roots as a champion of new voices and powerful stories. And in William Sterling's old office, now shared by both Marcus and Emma, a framed copy of The Price of Silence hung beside the photograph of his grandfather, reminding them that some things were worth more than money, truth, justice, and love among them.
If this story has touched your heart and you want to keep discovering more moments of transformation and deep emotions, subscribe to the channel and join our community. Don't forget to leave a comment, give us a like if you enjoyed it, and most importantly, join us for the next video. Each story is a doorway to a new perspective, and together, we're creating a space to reflect and connect with experiences that truly matter.